Today, my resolution is to send more military aid to Ukraine and Israel for America to uphold global justice. The year is 2024. We are not currently at war with Iraq nor Afghanistan. It's important to remember this because it feels as though we are collectively traumatized by the nation-building exercises that we undertook in these two countries, and it feels as though we are incapable of understanding any other conflict or imagining any other outcomes than being quagmired for 20-plus years in countries that don't really want us there. Support for Ukraine is essential if America is to be seen as a safeguard of democracy, economic prosperity, and a safe and secure Europe. Some still scoff at the idea of America being able to maintain any of these ideals around the world. While it's true that our record is far from perfect, the reality is that someone will rise to the occasion of leading the world into the future if America does not. Perhaps you say that America is not worthy. I challenge you then, who is? Russia, with Putin leading it into conquest after conquest, peeling territory away from states who don't bow to Putin's whims, such as Moldova, Georgia, and now Ukraine, a country hell-bent on supporting Iran and all of their terrorist proxies in the Middle East, a man who destroys entire cities like in Aleppo or Mariupol as he conducts warfare with zero regard for human life. Would you trust China to lead the world? A country on the precipice of conflict with Taiwan, a country who also stands accused of the forcible removal and genocidal destruction of the Uyghur population for its own territorial conquest? Support for Ukraine is essential to the United States for three key reasons. Firstly, support for Ukraine is a resounding no to Russia's imperialistic conquest in parts of the world. Why should we stand for Russia unilaterally deciding that they alone have a right to destroy the borders of a country that the entire world, Russia included, already recognized almost 30 years ago? All of us made promises to the territorial integrity of Ukraine, and again in 1994 as part of the Budapest Memorandums when we and Russia promised Ukraine the integrity of their borders in exchange for a decaying nuclear arsenal left there by the collapse of the Soviet Union. What message is sent to the rest of the world if we were not to ensure their sovereignty? Every country would understand that the only way to guarantee their borders would be through the pursuit and acquisition of nuclear weapons or being forced to cower under the nuclear umbrella of another nuclear power. Secondly, supporting Ukraine allows us to fight in one of the most direct ways possible against an enemy that we should all stand in opposition to as Americans. If Ukraine were to regain control of her entire borders, Crimea included, Russia would no longer have free and unconditional access to the Black Sea and, consequently, to the rest of the world in the wintertime. Russia's power projection would be severely hampered, forcing them to engage in diplomatic and economic negotiations more as opposed to the militaristic conquest Putin has grown accustomed to. Russia would no longer, as easily, support Iran, fund or deliver arms to terrorist organizations such as Hezbollah and the Houthis. It would no longer be able to easily support Assad as he unleashes chemical attacks and devastations upon his own people. Never will the U.S. have such a great opportunity to so cheaply and easily provide weaponry and defense in a conflict that will surely drain Russia of its capacity to terrorize the rest of the world in the future. Thirdly, and most importantly, we should support Ukraine because it's the right thing to do. In this conflict, the moral authority undeniably rests with the Ukrainians. I find it noteworthy that when we speak about the Ukraine-Russia conflict, it seems that we only speak of the interests of what's in America's interests and sometimes of our European allies, and then sometimes in terms of what Russia's interested in. What of the Ukrainians, though, whose will to fight remains unbroken? Are they not to have any say whatsoever in the future of their country or their borders? If they have the personnel to fight, are we to deprive them of the material to do so if we can so easily provide it? If we do indeed agree, as we should, that Ukraine has the right to fight for their territorial integrity, why would we not provide the means to do so for as long as they have the will to fight and as long as we have the ability to provide? Support for Ukraine is not only strategically important, it is a vital moral necessity that we continue to support Ukraine in their desire to reassert their borders and to deny Russia its territorial conquest in Europe. Israel, on the other hand, provides an interesting example where America's influence exists not just to bolster or provide for military support, but also to force and compel restraint. Israel obviously needs no support from the United States to defeat her enemies today, especially in Palestine, but the support we provide can condition her to act in a more humanitarian way. The United States has forced Israel at times to slow her aggression in the Gaza Strip, give more time for civilians to evacuate, allow humanitarian aid into corridors where Israel previously denied it, and recently, Biden has even applied pressure to the West Bank settlements, levying harsh penalties on settlers accused of violence against Palestinians in the forms of sanctions. If the United States were to diplomatically and financially withdraw from this reason, why would Israel halt or pause any of their aggression against any of the Palestinians? Historically, Israel has been forced to show restraint as well due to pressure from the United States, such as withdrawal from the Sinai in 1956 after hostilities had escalated with Egypt. Ukrainians have a right to have their borders defended, and the U.S. is the best place to help them militarily. If we value at all the lives of Palestinians as well, the U.S. is one of the only countries that could force Israel to show restraint, so we ought to continue to do so. While I'm sympathetic towards those who remain skeptical of U.S. foreign policy after our Middle Eastern blunders of recent decades, it shouldn't cause us to turn a blind eye to every conflict where the U.S. may intervene in a potentially righteous way. If we have any responsibility to the world whatsoever, it should be to help nations defend themselves.
For our first speaker, speaking in the opposition, we have Mr. Jin Watanabe.
Speaking of opposition?
Sure. Go ahead.
I'm not exactly prepared for that. But I guess I will be speaking in the opposition. My name is Jin Watanabe. I've been a big fan of Destiny's for a long time, and I agree with a lot of his points, but for the sake of debate and what we're doing here, we're going to be speaking in the opposition. And I think my general disagreement with what Destiny's saying has to do with military aid overall as a concept. Why should America bear the cost of Ukraine or Israel or anyone else's defense? You know, we often talk about the fact that America lags behind the rest of the world in life expectancy, in math ability, and all these other measures. And the question is why? And maybe it's because we spend way more than every other country on defense, and that defense specifically protecting other countries, right? Through direct military aid, but also through our defensive posture all over the world. We're using our military projecting power, and so other countries don't have to, which is very noble, of course, but is that really the right thing for us to do for the people of the United States? Countries around the world get to spend lavishly on welfare programs, healthcare programs, education programs, all the stuff that we can only dream of doing. Meanwhile, America bears the burden of keeping the world safe. It's my contention that America should stop spending on military aid abroad generally, also reduce our military spending, but that's separate, and instead do more to improve the lives of our people back home. I think this argument applies to every developed country that receives military aid from the United States, whether it's a NATO nation, Japan, Korea, and yes, Israel is a developed nation now with the economic and military resources to defend itself. Ukraine is a little bit more complicated because it's not as developed, so I'd like to address it in more specific. The question of what would happen if we withdraw aid to Ukraine is, I think, the big issue here. For one, I think the chance that Ukraine falls is limited. At this point, the war has been fought to a stalemate. Even if the US were to withdraw aid, it seems unlikely that Russia will be able to take over the country. And in that situation, we're basically funding the Ukrainian counteroffensive attempts, which I don't think is necessary, right? Destiny was talking about how this is like such a cheap way to stop Russian action. But at this point, Ukraine seems to be handling it themselves, and we did not sign up for funding a forever war in which Ukraine is continuing to go on the counteroffensive. Now, it's possible that Ukraine does fall or becomes close to falling, and the countries that are most threatened by that prospect should be the ones funding Ukraine, and Europe is now stepping up, which is great because it should not be the United States that's leading that. And even if Ukraine does fall in that worst case scenario, right, I still don't see that as a big, massive threat to the United States that merits us spending billions of dollars to support Ukraine, because Russia's further expansion is limited by NATO, by other things. The idea that the amount of terrorism that they can support, Iranian activity that they can support is dependent on how much aid we're giving to Ukraine, I'm very skeptical of that. And regardless, Russia is a declining power, and I don't really see them as a threat to the United States. Will this embolden Russia slightly, embolden other countries? It's possible, but overall, I think this thinking where we have to step in every time a country invades another country or a rival power flexes its muscle. It just leads us into these constant interventions, these forever wars that we've dealt with. And I don't think that's the best use of our resources. Now, right now, we've provided, if I have the number correctly, $75 billion in aid to Ukraine since the war started. And my question is, would that money not have been better spent on extending the expanded child tax credit, which we allowed to expire, or improving Obamacare subsidies, or forgiving student loan debts, or any of the other things that we could do domestically? In terms of the resolution, you know, I'm not here to debate the merits of the Israel and Ukrainian wars. It's possible that they are fighting just wars, but I don't believe that it's the United States' responsibility to uphold global justice. Imagine, just think about what that means, that it's our responsibility to uphold global justice. Why? America has limited resources. Every dollar of taxpayer money sent to Ukraine is a dollar not sent to a struggling single mother, not sent to a homeless veteran, not sent to a young student who wants to go to college, right? So when we consider this resolution, just remember that. Thank you.
Next docketed speaker, we have Ms. Rashika Prasad.
Now, even if we grant that the most important thing for the US to be focusing right now is global justice, not only do I believe that there are other ways that we can achieve this, but also that that really should not be our priority right now. As the previous speaker mentioned, the US has a host of problems, and there is no value to simply going out into the world and trying to fix it when we have so many issues on our own ground. The reason for that is that if we lack a strong American people, a good healthcare system, and a good job market, then what we have is a country that is fundamentally fragile. And how can a country that is fragile possibly lead the world as a beacon of democracy and hope when we can't even protect democracy and hope in our own borders? Now, even if we're going to say that global justice is the most important thing for us to focus on right now, we have to think about it from a more nuanced perspective. Because here in the US, I would say that the policeman is not the same as the judge. And similarly, in the global context, the US cannot function if we are trying to both govern what is right and be a leader and also do all of the hard work ourselves. Our justice system is not based off of one guy who is ensuring justice for everyone, but rather a system of people who have decided to work together for a specific goal, such as law and order, and for the protection of the innocent. And without that general agreement, you're not going to have anything productive. You are not going to have a world where we can actually protect global peace if the US is the only one trying to do it. But by continually sending more and more aid each time we feel like it, other countries feel like it is not their responsibility to contribute to the global wars that are going on right now. And not only that, but as the previous speaker mentioned, a lot of these wars are what's known as forever wars, in the sense that it is a series of stalemates, guerrilla attacks, and things that generally are not progressing in any direction. Much of that is because we are seeing an equal amount of action on both sides. Since Israel can depend on the US for so much funding, the way that they are fighting Hamas is fundamentally based off the assumption that they're very comfortable in the amount of money that they have. And so they're not really taking any actions that are specifically meant to end the war, but really to just outlast the Palestinians. They are banking on us to allow them to try and outlast the people they're fighting. Now, if we look over at Ukraine and Russia, we see another thing happening, which is many countries in Europe who are slowly stopping funding Ukraine because they believe that the US is rich enough to pay for the battle that's going on in their own backyards. Now, that is not to say that I disagree with Destiny here, because I do think it is our moral imperative to help people who are in need and to help the Ukrainian people who are fighting very hard for their freedom. And there is a lot of value that exists in having Ukraine being a stable state in Europe. But the problem arises when we try to do it all ourselves. Now, this motion specifically says that we should send more aid, not just keeping it where it is right now, not just keeping on with the 260 billion that we have already sent Israel since World War II, but sending even more than that. And if the absurd amount of money that we have sent so far hasn't been sufficient to end the war, adding more is going to do basically nothing. Another thing that Destiny mentioned was that Israel is being stopped from committing war crimes by the US's influence and by its funding. But frankly, that's not quite true. While the US has tried to caution Israel against doing things that are against international law, they've really taken no drastic action. And if you look at what most of the reports are actually saying, then you see that all of these horrible things are still coming to pass, whether or not the US would like it to happen. And even then, the US is mostly allowing these things to be brushed under the rug. So when we're trying to look at the US as a force to try and protect human rights in international borders, it's not really worth very much if we're actually not doing that despite the amount of money that we're spending. In addition, Destiny mentioned that this is a good way for us to ensure that Russia is sort of depowered to drain of our resources. But if a nearly years-long war hasn't been enough to do it till this point, then what is going to make you think that adding even more money and making it last even longer is going to do it? Clearly, Russia is in this because they have already invested in it and they really can't just let go now. And so adding more money is really just going to be a waste when Ukraine is more than sufficient in the amount of funds that is received so far. And that's why, in general, I urge you to vote in opposition to resolved, send more military aid to Ukraine and Israel to uphold global justice.
So, given that our speaker spoke in the opposition, she has the option of debating Mr. Bonnell for about 10 minutes, if you would like to. You were spoken up properly. No. Okay. And for our final speaker of the night, we'll have Mr. Nikolai Spine, and we'll move on to the debates. Mr. Spine.
Thank you, Mr. President. Being Russian myself, I feel like a hug. But yeah, in the era of modern conflict, where there is a consistent suffering among our allies under thunder of injustice, it's really hard to argue in opposition to the current resolution. Nevertheless, today I'll give it my best. The portion of the resolution that I take issues with is why we support justice. For some abstract notion, will American be ready to die? Will American be ready to spend their money? Will American be ready to sacrifice their kids' future? I really doubt that. Why is that? That whom we call terrorists, they call themselves freedom fighters. Are we both right? Are we both fighting for justice? Are we both wrong? One right, one wrong? The point being, who decides? Someone might argue that our values are more popular and more accepted across the world. To that, I would like to respond that a lot of injustices that we currently consider as a standard, as a concentration of evil, such as slavery, imperialism, indiscriminate murder of civilians, all of those things were considered normal by consensus of the world. I really doubt that Mr. Bonnell will be using a higher law argument. So utilitarian, I guess it is. But you can even make utilitarian argument why America should uphold justice. The issue that America have been facing for the past 20 years is deterrence versus appeasement. Politically, it's more beneficial to be an appeaser. Everyone likes appeaser. Everyone likes Obama and his so-called soft geopolitical policies, which were not in fact soft. But as Teddy Roosevelt once said, speak softly and carry big sticks, you will go far. However, nowadays, according to Victor David Hanson, modern politician, well, we speak loudly, obnoxiously, and we carry no stick at all. There was no decisive action under Trump nor Obama regarding the issue in Ukraine. Nevertheless, there was a lot of talk, there were a lot of statements, there are currently a lot of statements that Putin is dictator, but all this effort in the talk should be put in action. Let's look back at the start of war in Ukraine. US could have been doing so much more in the beginning of it, taking decisive action, ensuring more favorable terms for negotiation from the side of Ukraine, which would have been achieved sooner with fewer civilian casualties. However, instead of good policies, we focused on good politics, popular politics. The talk we hear about justice is also a part of this meaningless politics. We hear politicians insulting Putin quite a lot, but we don't see the same effort put in the military aid voting. There is no justice that guides countries' actions, just pure pragmatism, just pure pragmatic evaluation each step. The reality is, the only reason why we consider enforcing the justice is because throughout the time span of history, we were taking pragmatic action, ensuring that we get as much power as we could. Referring to World War II, we didn't start participating in World War II until Pearl Harbor. We waited for clear trigger, clear objective and motivation. And so we should not rush in support for Ukraine and Israel, while the only motivator for us is simply justice. Our action have to have clear reasons and motivation. And global justice, I'm sorry, that just doesn't cut. Average American doesn't care that much about justice as much as they care about gas prices and grocery and healthcare prices. Even oil price argument appears to average American better than some abstraction. So I would like to refer to the Iraq example that was pointed out in Destiny's speech as a failure. Well, I don't think it is. I think Iraq demonstrated us how we can unite with one particular trigger. It doesn't have to be justice. It just have to be some powerful emotion that allows us all to unite around it. And the casualties, the innocent casualties of the terrorist acts also would be an example of that. The point, Americans have to see the impact on their own country first. Furthermore, we forgive human rights violations in Saudi Arabia since it's our ally. Let's keep it that way. We act rationally and pragmatically. In the world of idealism, in the world of politics, idealists finish the last. We should not be idealists. Action should be called and calculated. Let's send military aid to Ukraine and Israel to achieve our strategic objective, but not in the name of an abstraction. Don't fight for ideals. Fight for your citizens, along your citizens. I urge you to reject the resolution.
Now, before we conduct our one-on-one debates, would Mr. Bonnell like to give a rebuttal to any and all of those speeches, or would you like to just go ahead? Mic should work now.
All right, is my mic working now? Yep, cool. All right. It's a lot of arguments given against military support. I hear these over and over again. I find most of them to be unconvincing. So the first argument that comes up oftentimes is people have a misunderstanding of how the budget works in the United States government when it comes to discretionary spending. So people will look at Ukraine and they'll say, we spent $90 billion on Ukraine. Well, what if we spent $90 billion on the United States, such as on homeless people or sick people? There's a couple problems. One is we can't use like old World War II or old Gulf War weaponry on homeless people, unless you're a conservative, I guess. So one, a lot of the stuff that we're sending over to Ukraine is just stuff that we don't use actively in our military anymore. That stuff can't be used in the United States any longer to help those people. Number one. Number two, we do cash infusions as well, like humanitarian aid or, favorable loans, et cetera, et cetera. However, I find it shockingly suspicious that the same people that talk about not wanting to spend money in Ukraine would, wait until hell freezes over before they'd actually spend money on homeless people in the United States. I don't see conservatives lining up to increase affordability for healthcare or to help affordability for college education on the contingency that we stop funding the war in Ukraine. Our funding for the war in Ukraine is a recent thing. Conservative opposition to funding literally any domestic welfare program, that opposition has existed for decades. So just because we stop spending money in Ukraine doesn't mean we're suddenly going to start spending money domestically. I just don't believe that's going to happen. Also, there are other economic interests to defending places like Ukraine or defending places in the Middle East, because that ensures the United States has economic access to these places as well. If we were to look, for instance, what if Ukraine became a part of the national state that Russia wants to construct with Russia, Belarus, and Ukraine, and now we no longer have access to food from Ukraine, or say Russia decides to cut off access to energy for Europe or the United States. These are things that at the end of the day will have a very real impact on the budgets of ordinary Americans or ordinary European citizens that might influence who they decide to look favorably upon in the future. So I don't believe there's a strong economic argument for not supporting Ukraine or Israel. I think that there is a strong economic argument that runs exactly counter to that. And if you want more domestic spending, then ask for more domestic spending. Domestic spending is not contingent on spending overseas. We literally print our own currency. It's not true that we have to worry about one or the other. When people talk about signing up for a forever war, I agree that we are not in a forever war. Or I agree that we shouldn't support a forever war. I understand that most of you guys are young, but 1 year is not forever. Neither is 2 years. The war in Ukraine has not been lasting that long. Yes, it has moved into a positional war right now as things have become kind of mucked up on both sides, but the situation only improves dramatically for Ukraine from here. It does not get any better for Russia. Ukraine is on the eve of finally having functional F-16s that will hopefully be active by the end of this year. Russia is on its knees begging North Korea for missiles and weaponry. The idea that the situation would improve for the Russians when they can't even mobilize their population because of how unbelievably unpopular it would be for them, whereas Ukrainians are literally committed to fighting to the last, their last dying breath. I just don't see this argument that we're stuck in a forever war yet when Ukraine hasn't even really begun to fight. Also, I think we have to worry about the message that we send. Is 1 year in a country or 2 years of a country fighting enough to deter any U.S. support? Are we going to say the exact same if any other U.S. ally is pressured? Are we going to say the same when Taiwan gets pressured by China? Are we going to say the same when the Baltics or NATO countries get pressured? A lot of people will say, like, oh, well, those are NATO countries. It's different. Is it? I never hear anybody make a counter argument for supporting Ukraine where they say, well, we shouldn't support Ukraine because they're not in NATO. I hear the counter arguments as being we should support our domestic population. It's not right to pour money over there. Other people need to contribute. All those same arguments you can make for not supporting NATO countries as well. As for the argument of, whoa, oh, sorry, okay. As for the argument of, other people should chip in. I agree, other people should chip in, and other people have been chipping in. I think up to this point, I think the European Union has provided almost $100 billion in aid and other cash equivalent things to Ukraine. The European Union has done that. And even when you look at military operations, say, down on the Strait of Aden, offshore of Yemen, the United Kingdom are sailing some of their warships down there to help the United States as well. I do agree that we shouldn't be going these missions alone, as sometimes we've wanted to in the past, but I think Biden has done a good job at building coalitions among global allies. So yeah, I mean, in summary, I think that domestic spending is good. That's not contingent on spending in Ukraine. I think that the economic advantage that we would enjoy is going to be greater if we support other countries instead of just letting other countries dictate what the economy around the world is going to look like. And I don't think we're even close to being in a forever war yet. I think that Ukrainians still deserve our support. I think we can still give more support. And that's why you should support the resolution for the United States to fund our military interests around the world.
Okay. Now to conduct our one-on-one debates, Mr. Cornell, could you please make your way back to the podium? And for our first one-on-one debate for the night, we have Mr. Jin Watanabe back on the podium.
What's up, Stephen, Mr. Cornell, Destiny? I guess, what's like the right format for this? I'll just give my individual points and you can rebut them. For the first thing you said about how domestic spending and foreign spending are not the same, well, I know this deal fell through, but the idea that Biden was pushing a deal where we would give the Republicans what they want on the border, and in exchange we would get Ukraine. Well, why couldn't we have made a deal where we said, we'll give the Republicans what they want on the border, but we get what we want on a different issue? So I do kind of feel like even there may not be a direct trade-off, but what Democrats are focusing on, I think, should not be Ukraine. It should be something more important, frankly.
I agree a little bit in what you're saying. So there is joint legislation right now that's getting shot down. However, I think if you listen to what Republicans in the House are talking about, I don't think that they're actually fighting against Ukraine. I think their goal right now is to basically stop any progress being made on the border, because now that the economy is improving and people are realizing it, that is literally the only possible issue that Trump can fight on the election coming forward. And I think Republicans will remain steadfast in making whatever excuse possible to not fund anything at the border whatsoever, because they don't want to give any sort of edge or victory to Democrats in Congress. So right now they're saying it's because of aid to Ukraine. I don't believe that. I think they will find literally any reason right now to oppose border aid, because it's the one issue they can fight on.
Okay, yeah. I guess, okay, here's another point that you brought up, which is that if Ukraine fell, that would be a cost to Europeans and Americans because food and energy. I feel like the United States at this point is energy independent, and we're definitely a food exporter. So I feel like those costs fall on the Europeans, which is just furthering my argument that they should be the ones stepping up to defend Ukraine, which they are starting to do, rather than us. I feel like our interest in that region is relatively minimal at this point.
I feel like right now when we look at the world, I think we kind of take for granted how much authority the United States has when it comes to negotiating bilateral or multilateral trade agreements, or when it comes to kind of like our nuclear or military umbrella that kind of ensures safety in the parts that we operate in. I think that it's easy to look at it and say, okay, well, the United States, we're just not going to do military stuff for you guys anymore. And I think tomorrow, that's fine. But I think the problem is when issues crop up where military aid is needed, rather than every single European country saying, hey, we all need to like hardcore restart our military program so we can defend ourselves, they're probably just going to look to another superpower to take over for them. They'll be like, okay, well, fine, I guess the US doesn't want to do it. Does Russia want to do it? Does China want to do it? And then I think slowly over time, what you'll see is like a shift towards a world where the polarity kind of moves in the favor of the East, in the favor of Russia, in the favor of China. And who's to say for future trade negotiations or agreements that those don't start to look highly disfavorable for the United States, where Russia and China are now dictating the terms of trade between, say, the European Union and the US, rather than the US getting to dictate it on our own terms. I think that would be scary. I think I don't remember if I gave the example or not, but like imagine, for instance, right now off the coast of Yemen, imagine if the Houthis said, well, listen, China and Russia are guaranteeing safe passage through here, but if your ship is headed to the United States or a US ally, we're actually going to blow those ships up. Well, now the US has to sail their ships through unfriendly waters in the Mediterranean, I guess, since we're not going to be as friendly with Europe. We've got to sail through unfriendly waters in the Middle East, since I guess we wouldn't be supporting Israel anymore. And now what? Our warships are trying to guarantee trade through all of these waters. Like, I think that the situation becomes a lot more hairy when we start to lose allies, whereas right now we just take it for granted that the US can basically sail our ships anywhere we want, not just because of our power, but because of our friendly relations with so many other countries.
4 minutes left.
I can see that, but I feel like the appeal of the United States as a partner, as a diplomatic ally, as an economic ally, does not need to be contingent on us basically bribing all of these other countries. I think countries would rather align with the United States than China, generally speaking. And so we don't need to be giving them billions of dollars of aid for that to be the case.
I mean, I don't know. I think we do. I think that when Egypt settled peace with Israel, I think a big part of that in '79 was the United States saying, hey, we're going to give you a ton of money to do it because we're going to support all you guys. I think countries like to see their economic growth and development. I think that bribing people with humanitarian aid or, favorable loans, I think is a good way to get people on your side. But also, I think the military part is really important. The idea that, like, if you're, like, man, I can't imagine if you're in the Baltics, right? If you're Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, and you watch Ukraine getting invaded by Russia, you're probably feeling pretty good, at least as a NATO country, like, whew, like, at least, like, that's not us. We're not Georgia, we're not Moldova, we're not Ukraine right now. So I think that does mean something.
Okay, yeah, sure.
Especially right now, I think it was yesterday, it might have been earlier today, Russia accused the Baltics of, like, interfering in their elections. That would be a really scary accusation if they weren't part of the US military nuclear umbrella, I think.
Right, 100%. Okay, the other thing you talked about is the forever wars, that you said that the situation is only going to get better for Ukraine and it can only get worse for Russia. I mean, I feel like if anything, that's an argument for the fact that we can sort of pull back on that situation because Ukraine is handling it, no?
Well, it can only get better for Ukraine as long as we support Ukraine. Ukraine has the bodies, we've got the weapons, basically. The Ukrainian population is motivated to fight because it's their country that's being invaded. Like, that entire population can be mobilized and they will fight to their last man to defend their country, but only as long as the United States is providing the military material to do so. I think as soon as we pull back or we stop, it's just going to turn into a meat grinder and they'll eventually have to forfeit whatever territory Russia decides they want to take from them.
I'm curious, at what point do you think the U.S. should stop supporting Ukraine? Like, at what level of success?
I think if the United States has maxed out what we feel is safe to do so for our military contributions, and we feel like Ukraine's not making good progress, then I think at some point we have to reevaluate if it's still stuck into a positional war. But I mean, like I said, like right now, like they haven't even gotten the F-16s online. We're not giving them as many HIMARS, or there's a whole bunch of other weapons that we're only giving them small amounts of because we're scared that they're going to do too well, basically, and start shooting into Russia, and we're worried about it escalating. So I think once we've made enough available to Ukraine that they can utilize, like if nothing changes from that point, then, I mean, obviously we'd have to reconsider at some point, but not in like 1.5 or 2 years, I don't think.
Okay. And then one more point in Ukraine. You kind of made the argument that our funding allows us to compel Israel in certain ways to be more humanitarian. But my question is, because Netanyahu basically just rebuffed the U.S. effort at negotiating a ceasefire and all of these things, if anything, our aid being unconditional would be enabling whatever non-humanitarian things they're doing, where if we were to threaten to withdraw it or just actually withdraw it, then they would be maybe more open to listening to what we have to say.
Historically, right-wing governments in Israel will talk tough, but they absolutely do not want to be on an island on their own against every other country in the Middle East. The U.S. alliance with Israel has been something that Ben-Gurion, even at the founding of Israel, obsessed with for decades in his life to establish. And I don't think Israel will throw that away so easily. I'm sure Netanyahu will talk tough, and he has to for his population. But if the United States were to cut the cord, we would see, I think, an entirely different animal in Israel. They would, return to the Yeshub days of anytime somebody attacks us, we just need to come over the top and kill 100, 1,000, however many civilians they feel they need to, and even neighboring countries. I think historically their allegiance, or rather their reliance on the United States for support, has tempered down their military conflict, I think, yeah.
Thank you, by the way.
Firstly, I'd like to thank you so much for your time today. So I wrote a couple notes on what you said. We'll just go through them on order.
Yeah.
Okay. So firstly, you mentioned that $90 billion is not something that can easily be moved. You cannot give homeless people tanks. Fair enough. But here's the thing. We're not exactly just using old military equipment for our current wars. We're consistently developing new materials. We are researching new things. And in fact, America is so focused on research for this thing that in the past decade alone, we have spent $46 billion on projects that were eventually canceled just because we were so excited to go into it and try and find new military techniques. So yes, while not all of the $90 billion can easily be moved into people, I'm sure quite a lot of it can be, because most of this isn't going to just be upkeep for our old, materials. Most of this is going into research for new things and also for the creation and manufacturing of more.
Our budgets have been increasing so much. Our deficits have been increasing so much on our discretionary spending. Where is all of the clamoring for the domestic spending? It's just not there. Like, I can understand people's frustration that we might spend in one area and not spend in another. But if we cut the spending in the other area, I don't think it's going to increase any of the domestic spending on the issues that we think are important. Like, I agree that more should be spent towards healthcare or education or homeless people or any other number of things. But if we were to cut all funding tomorrow to Ukraine, I think we would make exactly zero progress on any of that. Like, I mean, yeah, like you can see the budget exploding under Trump. The budget has exploded again under Biden. If we wanted to spend the money, if the political will was there to do it, we would do it. But there's just like a handful of people in the House that call for it, and otherwise that's it. Again, I'm sympathetic towards the view that we need to spend domestically more, but I think that these fights are just completely and totally separate. It's like saying that I really pissed off my math teacher today, so I think my friend is going to bully me after school that goes to like a totally different school. There's just like, I don't think there's any connection there whatsoever, other than it's all dollars at the end of the day.
Right, but even if we are in deficit, you do agree that there is some degree of an upper limit to how much money we can spend. And while it is flexible within that, I do think that reducing the amount of aid that we spend on military projects and that we spend in the military in general would still at least allow the argument to be furthered by people who are trying to spend more money on education or housing, etc., to at least have a leg up to say, now that this no longer exists, let us now put more money into it. Because if you try to bring a bill right now as it is and say, hey, let's spend more money on this thing, everybody will ask, where will the money come from? This easily answers that question.
I just don't think it's ever happened. I mean, when Biden pulled out of Afghanistan, where were all the people saying like, oh my God, we're out of Afghanistan, now we can spend money on this? Or when the Iraq war finally ended, we wound down and we withdrew all of our people there, where was everybody saying like, oh my God, we're out of Iraq, now we can spend money on this? And you know, I think Biden himself said that we were no longer participating in the Saudi-led coalition in Yemen, where were all the people saying like, oh my God, we're no longer participating in that, now let's do this? Like, again, I'm sympathetic towards wanting to increase domestic spending, but like I also agree there's like a limit to the amount of money that we can spend, no offense to any MMTers in here, but like the reality is that like we've spent so much, the deficit has blossomed into this massive, disgusting, hideous flower of overspending every single year, and none of it has gone towards the domestic, well, I mean, some of it's gone towards the domestic projects we want. I just don't think that the fights are at all combined. I think that when you say the fights are combined, I think you're buying into conservative propaganda that just lets them infinitely whittle away at every single particular thing they want to. Because I live in California, I heard conservatives say this. Today, it might be if we stop funding Ukraine, we can finally put money towards this. I think tomorrow would be if we finally stop funding state schools, we can put money towards homelessness. Or if we finally, stop wasting money on drug testing or food stamps, we can spend more money on this thing. Like, I just think, we don't need to cut some programs to fund others. It's just fundamentally not how the budget works, I don't think.
So would you say that we could just ignore the wars in general, let them continue to happen, and then simply focus all of our efforts on trying to emphasize, say, for example, more food stamps?
I don't think we have to focus on anything. I mean, we're a country. We do a ton of things. We spend money on a ton of different international things, whether it's humanitarian aid to countries, whether it's military spending, whether it's loan guarantees, whether it's there's like a billion different projects that the United States government is undertaking at any point in time. I think it's a misunderstanding of government policy. Maybe as Americans, our minds are always focused in one direction, like we can only be doing this particular thing. But the reality is we do so many different things at the same time. Like despite our involvement in foreign wars, we got that child tax credit under Biden, which was responsible for a significant cut in poverty rates with homes with children. And that was a thing that we did without ending any wars at all. So I think as long as the political will is there to push for a particular thing domestically, I think we can do it. I don't think it has to come at the cost of anything else. And I don't think we can only focus on one project at a time.
But don't you think that because these wars are currently existing, they're soaking up a lot of the attention that people, and generally the voting populace, even the people who are working on maintaining this war's time, it's soaking up all of this time and attention that could better be spent fixing these things. If, say, for example, the same analysts that were working to make decisions in relation to these two wars were instead working to try and find a way to improve the system of, say, our public education, don't you think that's better mental effort and time and labor that could be spent on something other than a war?
Maybe, but maybe it would be spent on times figuring out like, well, how are we going to get a particular shipment if we feel like the European Union is not going to trade with us anymore because Russia's, compelling them to do so because of their support for Ukraine? What if it was the case that if the United States stopped supporting other countries, now we've got to make difficult decisions about trade partners because we no longer guarantee safe passages through things like the Mediterranean Sea or through things like even like the Panama Canal? I think that there would be huge costs associated with that we take for granted right now that we don't see. And the idea that if we were to just cut off ties from our military support for the rest of the world, that wouldn't cause a shift globally in the powers that guarantee, free passage through trade routes or guarantee the safety of countries. I think that down the line, I think that would impact us economically in a really negative way. And as for taking time and attention away from certain things, I mean, I agree that that is the case. Unfortunately, that's just the nature of a democracy. We can't let our enemies think, or we can't let other people around the world think that, America is too busy being, like a democracy, on the fringes of schizophrenia, where every 4 years we get a new leader and they do a totally different thing. So as long as we can just tie them up or occupy them for 1 or 2 years in this particular area, we know that they're going to change course and they'll abandon that mission eventually. Like, even if we're divided amongst ourselves at home about some policies, it can't be that the image we project, internationally is we're incapable of taking a strong position on anything.
I completely agree. And I think those are all detriments to an isolation creationist viewpoint if you're saying that America should completely pull out from all conflict everywhere and abandon all our trade routes, but that's not quite what this prompt is about. The prompt is asking specifically about sending more military aid to Israel and Ukraine, not to dealing with any of other conflicts in any of our other countries. And speaking of all those conflicts, don't you think our money would at least be better spent, if it must be constrained to the military specifically, on improving and bettering those things and the other genocides and other crises that are going on, rather than focusing on these two big things, if these other things, such as protected trade routes, are something that are so valuable?
I think that for military spending and for guaranteeing safety in other countries, I think it's all kind of like wrapped into the same thing. Like offense and defense very much go in line with each other. The Red Sea and the Strait of Aden are like a really good example of that, where you have military power projection that you might use to defend certain countries, whether we're talking countries in Southern Europe, whether we're talking Israel, or whether we're talking Saudi Arabia, where that same like aggressive or offensive spending and research is also used to defend, passage through those trade routes that are being really negatively impacted right now by the Houthis in Yemen deciding to, strike ships that want to sail through the Strait of Aden. So even if it seems like defending military spending, or in a place like Ukraine, like a defense of Ukraine aggressively, like putting money over there, is a form of offensive military spending, but it also ensures the defense of a country. It allows those airspaces to remain free. If for whatever reason Russia decided not to allow planes to fly through there, it allows us access to their economy. Russia wanted to draw them into a trade union prior to Yanukovych leaving. That was one of the reasons why he was driven out of the country, is because in 2014 he preferred the trade union of the Soviet era, of the Soviet-style state that Putin wanted to run, as opposed to the European Union and becoming a trading partner with them. So I think that there are, even in like the offensive military spending, I think there are defensive purposes done there that protect us, our allies militarily and our economy, even domestically.
Okay, so if we accept some benefits, such as protected airspace over Ukraine, that we get from funding this war, don't we also lose value in the sense that before you mentioned that this was a good investment, that Ukraine, it does have very fertile soil, that it will provide food for us in the future, that it can do many good things. Sure, but isn't part of the issue the fact that they are already winning? They have a lot of our military equipment already, and they have a lot of our aid, and that they don't really need more aid?
1 minute.
Part of the thing is, if you look at Russia right now, they are not really doing so well. Ukraine, strictly speaking, doesn't need more aid, or even quite the level of aid that we have right now, when it is doing well enough on its own already. So can you really justify that putting even more fuel into the fire is required just to ensure that it all burns down?
I totally disagree. I feel like Ukraine has not been given sufficient aid. And I feel like their generals, I think in a speech that was just made, I think a month ago, I'm not going to try to pronounce these people's names. But yeah, one of their generals was giving a speech about how the state of the war in Ukraine so far and the things that they're missing. And I think that Ukraine has done well with what we've given them, but we haven't given them much. Like most of what Ukraine has been able to push with has been drones and technology that they themselves have had to invest in, because the US hasn't given them the long-range weapons that they need to penetrate the layered defensive systems that Russia has set up. While Russia might not necessarily be doing the best, in that what they really wanted to do is take over the entire country, Ukraine is missing a lot of territory right now, like the entire Donbass, all of Crimea, and a giant land bridge that connects them to the south. If the war were to stop right now, or rather if funding were to stop right now, I think the war would stop right now, and I think Russia would just have that territory forever, and then what would be theirs to bargain with for Ukraine afterwards, if not try to push more and to take even more Ukrainian territory.
Time. Thank you.
Thank you.
I'm already starting to think this is my home, since I'm here for the third time. I liked what you said, that we just print our own currency. That's pretty much what Germany did in 1923. That did not work out very well. Now, this idea that money spent is inflexible is generous and concerning, but that's not the issue that I'm taking with the current resolution, right? You mentioned that one of the things that we are concerned about, whether Russia is going to be expanded towards NATO countries and inside NATO countries. Well, yes, we can support NATO countries, we can support Ukraine, but that doesn't mean that we are necessarily supporting justice, right? I'm taking the issue with this notion of justice that is specifically stated in the resolution. And justice is something we should do, but it seems like a lot of statements that you were expressing on the stage, it was something that is happening. How does the connection from what we should do come from the assumptions that it is right now, some state about the reality. So on the other hand, that Republican don't support Ukraine or Israel. I don't know, last time I checked, Nikki Haley is a Republican. And another thing, I think the main issue that Ukraine is facing right now strategically in the war is not the access to the weapons. We do send a lot of weapons. The main issue is the same issue that Russia is facing, and it's corruption. The issue is that when the local government officials are getting the access to a certain amount of money or a certain amount of funds, well, are those funds spent correctly? Are they spent on the humanitarian aid, ensuring safety of civilians? Are they spent on the drones? Because it does seem to be a big issue in Ukraine right now. And lastly, another issue in Ukraine, again, has nothing to do with the amount of weapons we send there. We can send more weapons, but the Zelensky ambition of fighting war as in a sense, I don't want to say theater. Obviously, I'm not a world leader. I'm just a college student. But for example, Zaluzhny was extremely against standing on the Bakhmut territory. It was not something that Ukraine should have spent so many resources. But Zelensky made it essentially a spotlight for Ukrainian army and necessary to invest so many resources for the battles that was not that strategically beneficial for Ukraine, and that essentially Ukraine eventually pulled out with great losses. Now, there were a lot of losses on the Russian side, but again, it was not justified. When you are on the defense side, you cannot waste so many resources.
So for the first issue of justice, I agree that I think justice is an important aspect of what you look at when it comes to conducting foreign policy, because the more just you are, I think the larger global coalition you can build and the more domestic support you can build for whatever it is you're trying to do. I think for Ukraine, I think the matter of justice is very clear there. I think that fundamentally states should have territory. They should have borders that are respected by every other country in the world. And that is an important cornerstone of, I think, ensuring peace after the dissolution of the Soviet Union, really from World War II onwards. The idea that states have borders and those borders are to be respected by surrounding countries, I think that's a really important cornerstone of how diplomacy works right now. The reality is that in 1991, Ukraine had borders that was recognized by the entire world, Russia included. And I think that in order to violate those borders, you need a really, really, really good reason to do so. And I don't think, the expulsion of Yanukovych was a good enough reason for Russia to invade Ukraine and start to peel away territory from that sovereign state. So I think that justice is on the side of the Ukrainians and the Americans by supporting them, or the rest of Europe by supporting them when we talk about matters of justice there. For the second point about like supporting Ukraine and whether decisions being made are strategic or not strategic, or the level of corruption that exists in the country. I agree that obviously, it would be crazy to say that corruption didn't exist in Ukraine prior to 2014. I'm pretty sure they were one of the most corrupt countries in all of Europe, if not the most corrupt country, I think, in all of Europe. That is definitely true, and I doubt all of that has disappeared after, the war has begun. But right now, I think that the country is pretty united in their purpose to fight against Russia, and I think that that's probably more important, is to defeat the foreign invader enemy before dealing with enemies at home. It might be the case that Zelensky is not always making the most strategically wise decisions, but I mean, they have, time to fight. They're gaining experience. They're getting more weapons. They're getting training and help by Americans and Europeans. I think that their position in the war will only improve, again, as time goes on, whereas I think Russia's will falter.
Okay, so you keep bringing up justice. I would like to hear, where do you believe that justice is coming from? So what the structures that you based in your justice argument on? And regarding the coalitions, right, I don't think that's true. And if you look at the history, one of the biggest coalitions among different countries, they're not based on some just ideas, they're based on ideology. When you have some underlying ideological basis, that the countries unite. And we had it with, essentially, in the case of the Soviet Union, it was happening in Germany, and it happened during the medieval time when it had a very influential empire that would essentially expand and spread the culture. So just because the countries unite in this particular case with United States on this idea of liberal justice in a narrow sense, right? Because again, if the definition of justice changes as the time passes, ethics evolve, so on and so on. It doesn't mean that justice is this cornerstone on which all the coalition are built for, on all the international relations revolve around.
Yeah, I mean, you could talk about any form of, deriving justice, but I would be hard-pressed to think of any form of justice that doesn't include territorial sovereignty. Like a people, have a right to self-determination, and that right of self-determination extends to the ability to have a country with defined borders, and you have a right to not be messed with by belligerents that are bordering you for not really, really, really good reasons. If somebody's trying to launch attacks or missiles or nukes or something from one territory to another, then maybe you have a casus belli for war. But like right now, that has not been the case for Russia. Russia does not have a good reason to undermine the territorial sovereignty of Ukraine. And I think if we were to have any form of justice internationally, it would be territorial sovereignty. What was the second part of what you brought up? I'm not taking notes, so.
I'm not sure. I was just talking.
1 minute more.
Sorry.
The second part I remember. The idea of like countries like working together and being friends with one another and that being like a shield against future conflict. I think that largely has worked out. I think people were worried about the collapse of the Soviet Union, that a unipolar world would like descend into madness and chaos. But I think Europe has for the most part enjoyed basically their most peaceful prior decades in all of European history as a result of being under the NATO umbrella, as a result of like coming together in larger, interstate things like the European Union. Like you just don't get attacked if you're a NATO country, except maybe by terrorists, because nobody wants to be on the receiving end of, like a NATO strike.
Okay, so regarding the point you brought up about sovereign nation and the borders, well, again, in the case of the communists, right, in the early communist writing, it would be ideas of internationalism, rejection of the border. So I don't necessarily think that's always the case. All right, well, if it's 20 seconds, I guess I'll finish here.
I feel like the Soviet Union cared about their borders a lot, right? They had the Soviet Union, they had the Warsaw Pact. I think it was important to them, right?
In the early 1920s, a lot of thinking in the Bolshevik Party seemed to be oriented towards internationalism, especially with Dzerzhinsky.
Oh.
Thank you. We will now be starting the Q&A section of the event. If any one of the audience members would like to ask a question and a follow-up question, please line up now.
Hi, thank you so much for coming. Please correct me if I'm wrong, but my understanding is when it comes to the settlements in the West Bank, you generally oppose them. And I know you mentioned how a benefit to U.S. aid to Israel is that we can generally move them in a better direction when it comes to humanitarian issues and other issues that we don't really support. I know you generally are also in favor of a two-state solution. So I guess my question is, would you support leveraging the aid we give to Israel to kind of push them more aggressively to, either withdraw from the West Bank, or if not, to at least end all further settlements in the West Bank?
Listen, I think the United States should invest in a big tunnel that goes from right to Hamas's headquarters to the West Bank, so they go and attack settlements all they want, okay, in a video game. The settlements are deplorable. It's just like the worst thing ever for everybody. I don't think it makes Israel more secure. Obviously, it pisses the Palestinians off, rightfully so. It pisses off literally the entire world. They're just a horrible, stupid thing. I think George Bush, was actually making aid contingent upon the the halting of the expansion of settlements. I think Bush did that at one point in time. But I know Obama shook his fingers at Israel, but I don't think anything happened. And then Trump loved Israel, so I don't think he would ever restrict anything there, I don't think. And then Biden has now finally started to issue pretty harsh penalties on settlers that are accused of violence against Palestinians, which I think is good. But the issue, if I had to guess, the issue right now is that, especially among older people, there's really, really, really big support for Israel in the United States, and any kind of attacks on settlers by the US government in the form of restricting aid based on settlements or whatever probably doesn't play well politically. So it's probably not a wise political position of the president to start attacking settlers on that basis. When I say attack, I mean through sanctions or whatever. But yeah, ideologically and militarily and strategically, the settlements are just a disaster that need to stop. But I understand why Israel doesn't want to stop them, because they're just trying to annex the West Bank. So, but yeah, I think there should be strong opposition to them. Yeah.
Thank you so much.
Yeah.
Hi, you've talked about this previously, how an alarming amount of people in the United States specifically are, well, their foreign policy positions essentially boil down to America's bad or just anti-America. And I was just wondering, do you believe that America is unique in this aspect of many of their citizens opposing their country's, I guess, military or foreign policy ambitions? And also, is there any way to make your position, I guess, more appealing towards those people?
So I think probably for too much of America's history, we've been a little bit too proud, and we've kind of turned a blind eye to bad things we've done in the past, domestically and internationally. So I think it's good to course correct a little bit. I feel like we've course corrected too much though, and now, especially among a lot of young people, it's just America bad is like the definition for everything. But the reality is that like really every major superpower has done quite a few bad things. Russia and the Soviet Union are not innocent of those bad things. China is not innocent of those bad things. Cuba, what? Oh. Sorry, oh yeah, Cuba is not innocent of those bad things. Yeah, literally everybody, like every country has been involved in their own like foreign adventures. And the United States is no stranger to that. I guess what I would encourage people to do is like just take a look from conflict to conflict and try to understand what's going on both sides, because there are some conflicts that we can probably support in a righteous manner, and there are other conflicts that are questionable at best, and maybe we shouldn't support them. Like, yeah, it's crazy that now I see like young people are like, oh my God, I read bin Laden's letter to America and this is based. And it's like, is it really though? Like, you understand what this guy's goals were, right? It wasn't an LGBT friendly society, that's for sure. I think it's dumb that people will look at like the Iraq war and now I hear people say like, oh, like we shouldn't have been involved in the first Gulf War. And it's like, really? You really think that? Yeah, I don't know. Look at each conflict, get an understanding of the facts and find which side you think we should probably morally support. And there's room for the United States to do that. And don't assume that we're the only ones that ever, do bad things. Plenty of other countries have done really bad things. It's just a lot of them don't exist anymore.
Hi. So you made the case for continued aid to Israel based on the fact that it could possibly restrain Israel in its fight in the West Bank and in, obviously right now in Gaza. You also made the case for continued aid to Ukraine based on the fact that Russia is engaged in a war of aggression, and that it would be the moral thing to do to help the Ukrainians. Would it not be the moral thing to do to provide material aid then to the Palestinians instead of to Israel, if the case for aid to Israel is to protect Palestinian civilians?
I think if there was a moral case to be made for Palestinians to do things like October 7th to Israel, I would agree, but I don't think there's a case for that. Right now, I'm pretty sure Palestinians are the largest recipient per capita of humanitarian aid in the entire world. And the United States leads that contribution of humanitarian aid. So they already get a ton of humanitarian aid. In terms of military support, I don't particularly like the idea of funding an Islamist, like actual avowed stated government whose goal is to destroy, a U.S. ally. So no, I don't think that any sort of military aid should ever be given to people like Hamas. I don't consider them at all to be equivalent or the same as like defending the Ukrainian government or even defending Israel against attackers that they have.
So you mentioned the fact that the United States is providing aid to Israel, not just because it's in a current conflict with the Palestinians, but because it's a U.S. ally. What actual strategic purpose does Israel serve for the United States?
So I think right now the axis that's kind of formed is you've got Iran, you've got Syria, you've kind of got Iraq, and then you've got the Iranian proxies like Hezbollah and the Houthis, and then that's all supported kind of by Russia and China. And I think that axis, I think Iran calls it their axis of resistance, that right now is standing in opposition to OPEC states that we support, like Saudi Arabia, and Israel has kind of become a part of that. I think that if we give up Israel and we allow them to fall into the influence of other people, that coalition that we built in the Middle East basically completely and totally falls apart. And then I think you'll see all of the other countries, the UAE, Bahrain, Saudi Arabia, Oman, and then like even Egypt would start to fall in the direction of Russia or Chinese influence. And I think given the importance of the Red Sea and the Mediterranean Sea and the Suez Canal, like that trade route being completely and totally 100% owned and operated by enemies of the United States that don't share interests, I think would be a really scary future to be a part of. So I think supporting Israel and Saudi Arabia and that kind of defensive link against the Iran axis of resistance that they call it, it's also supported by Russia and China, I think is really important there. So that's kind of what I view the lens of the Israeli stuff through right now.
So you talk a bit about morals and the justification for our involvement in these wars. And we also saw earlier sort of this separation between the international cause and the domestic cause, when I think really those two things are much more related. I think that Cornell's campus, especially, Benjamin Netanyahu's father was a professor at Cornell. He took a very expansionary but exclusionary view of Judaism and Zionism, and we see Netanyahu continuing a lot of the same thing. And before the Israeli war, people were talking about this is the death of the left liberal Zionists movement. You also talked about accepted borders. There were accepted borders for Palestine, and Israel has continuously encroached on them. How is Israel, in this case, justified in a very brutal war of offense in retaliation, and we're helping to escalate the whole situation?
Yeah, so I don't think there have ever been clearly defined Palestinian borders. I think that entire issue has been incredibly complicated. We can get more into the borders if you want. In terms of supporting Israel right now for their particular fight against the Palestinians, I would say their fight against Hamas is probably a justified one. I don't think literally anybody in the region wants Hamas there. I don't think Egypt or Saudi Arabia or Israel wants Hamas there. I think that at the end of the day, if any sort of negotiated situation is to be reached between Israel and Palestine, they need somebody to negotiate with, and it can't be with Hamas. It just can't be with essentially a terrorist government that just wants the destruction of Israel. That can't be the case. So once Hamas is removed, I mean, then the question of, who does Israel negotiate with afterwards has to be answered. And I think that's a tough one, especially because Israel, especially under Netanyahu, I don't think really want to negotiate with Palestinians. I think they do want to annex parts of the West Bank like Area C and just kind of continue their slow expansionism, especially, I think Netanyahu would absolutely want to do that. But I think in terms of right now, their conflict with Hamas, I think everybody in the region agrees that no Hamas is good for everybody there, both Israel and the Palestinians.
You're conditioning the leadership of Palestine on Hamas and their negotiating situation. I'm talking about how can we expect Netanyahu to facilitate a reasonably strong peace if, when we give him support, what we get back is a lot of right-wing influence through AIPAC that's pushing out progressives across the country and that sort of dissent. And in his own country, he's cracking down. How can we expect him not to continue to escalate and for us to continue to give aid to him?
I think that once Hamas is gone, I feel like the United States should pressure Netanyahu into some sort of negotiated settlement. The problem is what that looks like right now is just really, really, really hard, because for a long time, it feels like Palestinians haven't been as interested in negotiating like a two-state settlement. Whether you're talking about peace deals shot down in 2000 or peace deals shot down in 2008, it feels like Palestinians have been more geared to continue fighting Israel, or at least the solution that they want is not a two-state one, but either, it doesn't seem to be like a two-state one right now. So if in terms of like actually mediating a solution to that, the problem is there are so many players involved and there'd be so much political will exhausted on this that I don't think Americans care that much. But to have a real peace deal set out here, you would have to make Netanyahu, you'd have to make the right-wing government chill a lot on things like settlements or pushing for settlements. You'd have to bring Iran into some sort of deal where they stop funding all of this oppositional movement to Israel. You'd probably have to involve players like Egypt and Saudi Arabia so that they're also involved, because it might be, for a while I heard that Saudi Arabia was considering mediating some sort of new government in Palestine, that they would take head of in order to negotiate with Israel. It's a really complicated situation. I think that Israel's mission to destroy Hamas is good, but I do agree that after that happens, there needs to be a lot of pressure on Israel to negotiate some sort of peace agreement, but that pressure has to be on both sides. And I feel like it's historically been the case that Palestinians get hyped up so much from everybody else overseas that wants to see them fight, and then they fight and they get crushed and they lose even more every single time. That pressure for the Palestinians to fight has to disappear as well. And I think once that's alleviated, and if the United States wants to pressure Netanyahu and that right-wing government, and if other players in the region can also stop using Israel and Palestine as a battleground for their own proxy conflicts, meaning Iran and Saudi Arabia, then at that point you can start to have peace talks. But man, it just feels like there's so many conditions that need to be met for that to happen.
Hello. Sorry. Hello. Regarding the U.S. support for Israel, you've obviously stated your support, but you also stated a support for the two-state solution and for Israel to kind of calm down with the settlements. But I guess would you believe that there's sort of a line for U.S. support for Israel, especially when Netanyahu sort of repeatedly sort of rejecting the negotiations or rejecting the two-state solution very explicitly, whether it is him kind of turning a blind eye to the actions of the settlers in the West Bank or actively expanding settlements, or of Israeli politicians who are basically talking about resettling or annexing, I guess, the Gaza after the war. Do you believe that if the Israeli government continues over and over again to reject any kind of peace, do you believe that the U.S.'s support should there should be a line?
God, we're doing Israel-Palestine. The issue with this region is that like both sides continue to screw each other over, like over and over and over and over and over again. And to get either of them to kind of like come together for some negotiated peace is just so difficult. I think the issue that you run into right now with Israel is, from Israel's perspective, and they don't do themselves any favors, right? Because some people will argue that Israel is expansionist, and Israel say, well, no, not really. We just happen to expand every single time people attack us, which is true, but also, okay, well, stop. Like you run into this issue where they basically get provoked over and over again by surrounding Arabs, and then once they get provoked, they expand as much as they can, and then now the surrounding Arab states are even more provoked, and as time has gone on, they've kind of all chilled because they're like, okay, well, Israel's here to stay, we're gonna start fighting with them. But even in like the minor areas where Israel is seeing themselves as like giving peace, like historically, Israel fought against Egypt, they took the entire Sinai, and then Egypt was like, okay, fine, we're gonna negotiate peace, okay? The Soviet Union falls in '91, and without all the support from the Soviet Union, finally Jordan is like, okay, fine, peace. And then the Oslo Accords happened in '93, right? Every time Israel pulls out of someplace when they've shown weakness, it feels like they get punished for it. So they get disengaged in Gaza in 2005, and then Hamas now has ruled Gaza since 2006. They pulled out of southern Lebanon, and now there's Hezbollah. So I think from the Israeli perspective, the Oslo Accords failed to materialize in the Camp David Summit, I think in 2000. When peace failed to materialize there, the second Intifada happens, and then they also get attacked and punished. So I think the problem with Israel is they feel like every single time they show weakness or give peace, it ends up in some horrible terrorist attack or some horrible thing that now they feel like they need to show strength for. So there has to be less aggression on the Palestinian side and the support that they get from other people to push that aggression. But then I also agree, too, there needs to be less aggression from the Israeli side. They keep acting like they're the Yishuv of the 20s and 30s and 40s that are constantly on the brink of destruction, and they're not. Israel's there to stay. Everybody else knows it, but for some reason, Israel hasn't learned that yet. So every time they fight, they act like they're in an existential battle for their country, and they're not. They don't have to do the crazy reprisals and the retaliations, of the Haganah in the 40s, of the Israeli government in the 50s and 60s against the Fedayeen. They don't have to participate in wars like this anymore, but they continue to do so because they've got like that post-Holocaust mindset of everybody's going to eliminate them if they show any amount of weakness. I don't have like an easy, good answer, but yeah, both sides need to severely like calm the fuck down. And the problem is everybody is like riling both of them up to just fight, and it's so bad. It has to stop for the Palestinians, and it needs to stop in Israel too. But as long as there's pressure from either side to keep fighting, like both of them will gladly fight until most likely it'll be the Palestinians won't exist anymore. But yeah.
For the interest of time, we will not be conducting any follow-ups, but we will go through the rest of the questioners.
Hi, so this is a pretty general question and related to the actual topic, but I've always respected your political commentary just because it's clear that you create your opinions just based off of what you see in front of you, and you don't have like a political agenda or anything like motivating behind you. At the same time, and like your entire backstory of how you became a progressive was being able to establish yourself enough, like economically, to the point where you saw the privileges associated with having that kind of income. I'm kind of curious as to what kind of framework you draw as to how you form your opinions and how you might be able to change your mind, just because I do see there's an important aspect of retaining your ideologies. At the same time, there is always going to be a problem if you are too mercurial and too willing to change, which I don't think you are, but yeah.
I mean, in terms of what? In terms of like my personal moral positions or like my international foreign policy positions, or?
Does it differ?
Well, I guess so fundamentally, like I build most of my stuff on cooperation, and I kind of feel like liberalism and capitalism is an extension of that, or I would hope that to be the case. So, I mean, I'll broadly support capitalist and democratic ideals, and I guess broadly speaking, the United States and the things that the United States is supposed to stand for on a really broad level. If somehow, it's hard to imagine how, but if somebody, God, who's the quote? I should know this, but it's like no sooner can an American imagine like the end of capitalism than they can imagine the end of the world or something like that. It seems hard to imagine it, but if it was the case that some big study or some country proved that like, oh, well, socialism is actually a way better way to organize an economy and it affects all these things and it has like a better outcome and blah, 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 I would hope that I would change my mind. I'd be like, oh yeah, okay, maybe this is a better way to organize things. Or maybe we slowly continue to transition in that direction and it's like, oh, this is a better way to do things. But yeah, I guess if I ever wound up in an area where I was arguing against something, the two questions I always ask myself are, one, can I feel like I can argue the other side convincingly, which is important to me because I should understand both sides of the argument. And then two, I should be able to answer if somebody asks me like, well, what would it take to change your mind? You know? And if I can't think of anything, well, I don't know, would I ever change my mind? Then I'm probably too far lost down a particular thing. I think those are two really important questions that most people should ask themselves for whatever things they believe in.
Hi, thank you. I'm a really big fan of your stream, I just want to say first. But I had one problem, I guess, mainly with your support for Israel and the fact that you said that it should be unconditional for now and not have that threat to take away as we speak and as they're fighting their war with Hamas.
To be clear, just so you don't waste your question, I don't think our support should ever be unconditional, right? Like if it was the case that tomorrow, you know, they drop a nuke on Gaza City and like 500,000 Palestinians evaporate, I'd say, okay, well, this is obviously way too far. I don't think it should ever be unconditional.
Yeah, that was, I guess, my follow-up question was, is there an action, I guess, that Netanyahu or the Israeli government could take in the Gaza Strip that would cause you to withdraw your support immediately? Because right now we're at about, what, 21,000 dead, and I think majority are women and children, because we don't have the exact number between militants and civilians.
I don't believe the majority is women and children. I know that those numbers change sometimes. I've read an article about how those numbers change sometimes. I think the dead might be up to 27,000 now, from 21,000. I don't know what they're at. I don't think we've hit 30,000 yet, but I think we're around 27, 28,000. I mean, what would cause me to change my support? I mean, right now, really the only thing we can see publicly is like the ratio between dead militants, or what the IDF claims are militants, to civilians. And I think right now that ratio is like 3 to 1, 4 to 1 between civilians and militants, and given that it's highly urban combat, I think that's about what we would expect to see, if not even greater ratios of civilians dead. So I guess as long as the numbers stay within roughly that corridor, I would expect that Israel's conducting itself in a way that is attempting to minimize civilian casualties. That would be one thing I would look out for. Another thing I would look out for is I'm pretty sure that a lot of the Gazans in South Gaza now have been moved into the IPC 5, I think it's IPC 5 category of, I think it's IPC, but it's like the international, it's the UN's way of determining like food security basically. And if it was the case that you started to see like famine crises like break out across all of southern Gaza, and those conditions continued and endured, and like people started to die of starvation, we started to move in that direction, that would be something where we're like, okay, well, we need to stop and figure something out, because you can't just starve 1 or 2 million people to death as you conduct military operations. This is not okay. Yeah.
Hello, welcome to Cornell, and thank you for your time. So much of the global South has been hesitant to support U.S. positions on conflict and just other global issues. You support foreign aid in general, but how do we find support for U.S. positions from the global South when they often have negative views about the U.S.?
Man, that's a good question. And if I knew more about the global South, I would answer, but I'm not even going to try to bullshit my way through. I'm not going to try to, just because I know so much about like Ukraine, Russia now, I don't know so much about Israel and the Middle East. I feel like the South probably is a good reason not to trust us. Our whole policy during the Cold War of defending and upending certain regimes just because we felt like they didn't support us, even if the new regime that came in would be bad for the people there, probably for good reason makes them not trust us. But I mean, overall, I don't have a good understanding of how strong the relationship is between the United States and countries in South America, or yeah, I don't know enough. I'm not going to bullshit an answer and pretend. Yeah, like how do you make people like us? I mean, you trade with them, you stop messing with them, and then you, I guess, respect their governments and respect their countries, and hopefully over time, like the economic development gets people roped in together. I will say that multilateral trade agreements, things like not to trigger anybody, but the TPP, I thought was a really good idea, and I think it's really sad that we pulled away from that. I think huge multilateral trade agreements where everybody's on the same page and you're enforcing like the same worker rights between all the different participating countries are really important steps towards ensuring some level of like safe and secure coordination with each other. But yeah, particularly to the global South, whether you're talking South America or Africa, I can't speak to why they should or shouldn't trust the United States, because I just don't know enough about the relationships yet.
Ladies and gentlemen, Destiny.